Welcome back to the Rami and Steve show. This is our regular podcast, Minding Emotions, and this time we're deviating slightly. Last time we had musical instruments out. This time we're actually going to be talking about the state of metaphysics. What is metaphysics now in the 21st century? What has happened to it? You're going to sort of handle more of the psychology of metaphysics. Right. I'm going to talk about sort of what's happened in philosophy over the last, 100 years. I give a potted history of metaphysics. But we should introduce ourselves. I'm Stephen Asma. I am a professor of philosophy at Columbia College in Chicago, and I'm a fellow of the research group in Mind, Science, and Culture. And you are?
Rami Gabriel, and I'm an associate professor of psychology at Columbia College Chicago, and also a fellow at the research group for Mind, Science, and Culture.
Great. And so I thought maybe the way to start this out is we were talking about this, that there's kind of these parallel tracks of, on the one hand, there's sort of the professional views of metaphysics, what's happened in philosophy as a discipline, but then there's also sort of the popular culture or folk, theorizing about reality. And I think in professional philosophy, metaphysics basically disappeared in the 20th century, but it's never really gone away in the popular imagination, in large part because of, I suppose, of religion. So maybe we could start out with, let me give a kind of a quick thumbnail sketch of what metaphysics is, traditionally speaking, and what I think has sort of happened to it, and then let's see where you want to go with it.
Can I request that you also include like Rorty and Wittgenstein and that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. That's worth talking about in terms of the 20th century. So I think to jump from the ancients to the contemporary situation, I think we can do it. Probably ancient metaphysics was much more unified as a field, and you had the major players, the Pythagoreans and the Parmenideans. Particularly Pythagoreans had a big influence on Plato. I think most listeners will know that Plato thought there was the phenomenal world of appearances, the flesh and blood body of me, of you, but then Plato thought there's some kind of essence that's sort of hiding behind the appearance of things, and the extent to which the dialogues talk about the not just the beautiful object or the beautiful woman, but beauty in itself or justice in itself is the extent to which Plato is doing metaphysics. And famously, there's some debate about this, but by and large, it looks like Plato was a bit of a mystic on this and thought that there was another realm of these essences. Whether or not he thought of it in theological terms is debatable, although there's plenty of passages where he seems to suggest this. But the idea is to look beyond the phenomenal world to these forms that are the essences of things, and they're more real, and they do not change. They're eternal. So that's kind of the Platonic notion of metaphysics, and Aristotle comes along and says, well, a nice start, but Aristotle thought whatever these essences are, forms, they're embedded within the material world. They're not separate and don't exist independent of the world. And so matter and form are always together. So this is a sort of hylomorphic theory of Aristotle's causation. And then he set an agenda for metaphysics. He basically, very famously, there's a collection of his writings called the Metaphysica, the Metaphysics. And he didn't really have this word. It was called the Metaphysics. Sometime after he was dead, the school called this series of books that were about being the books that come after the physics. So Metaphysica means after the physics, and it meant for Aristotle that we were going to talk about causation, causality, God, being, and then if you fast forward, what happens is obviously religious philosophy, like Aquinas, turns it into a sort of marries all this to theology. And then in the modern sort of period, you get sort of the stripping away of certain kinds of metaphysical speculations, like is there purpose in nature? Because the scientific revolution strips that away, and you get a more mechanical notion of causation. But it's still metaphysics. We're still trying to understand what's the ultimate reality underneath the appearance of things. And then if you push that forward into the 20th century, you get the rise of positivism, logical empiricism, and so you see the Vienna Circle trying to strip away metaphysics altogether and think in sort of instrumental terms about what do we mean when we make predictions about nature. That's really all we can say about nature. We can't posit unseen vital substances or essences. All that stuff's got to go according to this positivist tradition. And then you see that continues in later Wittgenstein, who basically shifts things towards this linguistic turn, away from studying things or being, like Aristotle suggested, and instead now we're going to talk about language. How is it that language creates a kind of system or a language game in physics? And how is that different from the language game in biology? And how is that different from the language game of philosophy, for that matter? And then and at the same time that Wittgenstein is doing this, the pragmatists like James and Dewey are doing their version of this, trying to sort of eliminate or push traditional metaphysics aside in favor of what's pragmatically working and successful in terms of our predictions. And they're extending this to all the realms, like not just science, but ethics too. And something similar is happening in the continental tradition too, because you look at Jean-Paul Sartre says the whole tradition is wrong. It's from Aristotle down to the 20th century, everybody has said essence precedes existence, but now I, Sartre, am saying existence precedes essence, and that metaphysics is basically over, and we can't find these essential forms within us. We must make the meaning of our lives independent of metaphysics. So all of this sort of culminates in a 20th century that's fairly hostile towards metaphysics. And I think that some of it's coming back a little bit now because people are getting much more interested in some traditional metaphysical questions like freedom and determinism, I think in part because of the rise of neuroscience. Mm-hmm. But I think that's kind of that's a very potted, history of metaphysics in philosophy.
Well, it's really helpful, and I don't think I could offer like a psychological one because there's a far shorter history. Yeah. But there's some of the terms that you use that I think would be worth looking at a little bit more. When you're talking about, for example, the positivists, and they're trying to have sort of a subjectively neutral language, sort of way of instrumentalizing, obviously, like the Principia and all that stuff, where they're trying to just say, here are all the laws, here's the structure, here's the mathematical sort of world of forms structure of reality and of meaning. In a way, the psychologists are a little kind of like verificationists. Mm-hmm. You also have to have the empirical, well, if that's so, then how do you verify? I think Carnap was getting into that.
Yeah, that's right.
And in a way, I still see a connection with that approach and the pragmatic approach. Because the pragmatists are trying to say, well, forget like having essences and all these laws. Does it make a difference?
Right.
Does it do anything? If I believe this, what are the consequences of consequentialism? So if this is true, then what else is true? That's kind of like on the ground, this is, let's not get into the abstractions.
Yeah. And I mean, and that had a very productive and profitable career, if you think about the development of things like behaviorism, and some of the sciences that stopped thinking about like, well, what's the ultimate cause, and just went ahead with the pragmatic prediction science.
But one of the issues that also came up in philosophy was Quine's work, right, on empiricism.
Yeah.
Doesn't he have that paper where he's saying, even if you have all these laws, It's a sort of a net. And when you start moving things around, if you start moving things in the middle, everything else gets moved around. And I know the philosophers went forward, Putnam, and said, okay, this is how we're going to have to move around with physics and stuff. But I think the psychologists kind of said, forget it. We're just going to keep doing these stupid experiments and building up, like they built up the psychophysiology stuff. They built up they built up a field called behaviorism, and then now we've built up this thing called cognitive science. And it really seems that it's time to just put your head down and do experiments, and then we'll put it all together later. Like all these neuroscience. How many neuroscience experiments are there?
Yeah.
And then someone's doing reviews. People are doing reviews over years, but it's sort of an unwieldy, global, let's just do it approach. It's a little bit lazy in regards to the issues that, for example, Quine and some of the issues that were brought up in having a system and systematicity of knowledge.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. I mean, some people would argue, well, that's what's really good about 20th century science, is that they gave up on these grand narratives of being and ultimate reality, and just everybody does put their head down and just tries to solve these practical problems. But you're right. What's happening is all of that stuff is happening within a metaphysical framework that usually is just tacit and unrevealed and unreflected on, and just is quietly operating in the background and unseen almost.
Yeah, I would argue, actually, I'm writing this paper on metaphors, where I'm saying that metaphors are a way of reifying these structures, these analogical structures. So there's an analogy. The mind is like a computer, for example. The mind is like an engine. Then you take that and then you use that as a framework to do a bunch of studies, and then they're sort of tied to their era. You have these are the machines now, right? Descartes and his view, and then you have the computers, and then now we're getting to quantum computing, and people just find the most complicated thing in the world and say the mind is like this complicated thing. And that's what ties it together, but it's totally tacit metaphysics.
Yeah, that's funny that there's the assumption was that when you eliminated God from the picture, like in the early modern period, like with sort of the time period of Descartes and Galileo and then Newton, I think the idea was, we've gotten God out of the picture, so we've got a mechanical picture of the universe. And this is a perfect example, because when people pressed Newton about gravity, he was like, well, gravity is what happens when you roll this ball down this inclined plane, and you can measure it, and we have a way to make predictions about moving objects. And then he said famously, hypothesis non fingo, which is, I don't pretend to know what the cause of gravity is. I cannot know that. That is beyond the realm of appearances. But secretly, people think, well, that's God. That must be God. God is somehow behind. And if you get rid of all that stuff, it makes sense just so you can get about the business of science. But a mechanical worldview is a metaphysics too. That's the point, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like the way that it gets manifested is that, like, here's a law, the law of gravity, or here's the Avogadro's number, or something. Here's some relationships, and it seems that, like you're saying, there's, like, in cosmology has to deal with this. Cosmology, I think, the anthropic principle, right?
Oh yeah.
That everything was made for us, and that's why it is the way it is. So that's a way of getting around it, or answering the question that Newton wouldn't answer. Say it was made that way for a reason.
Right.
But then there's people like Lee Strolin, the other cosmologist, saying there are sort of an infinite amount of universes, and each one of them, they have the different numbers. And we happen to live in the one where the numbers add up. Right. So that we can have, that we exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. The traditional story was that why would nature have the structure it has unless a deity had imbued matter with structure, with logical structure and organization. That's the way we can read nature, and that's the way we can have laws of nature. And I suppose you're right. The more recent version of that design argument or teleological argument is the anthropic principle. There's kind of a weak and a strong version of the anthropic principle. I think the weak version is sort of methodological. It's like the universe makes sense, and we know that because we're making sense out of it. That's sort of the weak version. The strong one is the one that I think you were suggesting, which is the universe must have been designed because we can understand it. And that means not only can we understand it, but the likelihood of us ever existing is so low, the chances of us coming to exist are so incredibly low that the fact that we exist and can understand the world is basically a proof that the universe was made by design. Now, that's just straight up, that's the kind of stuff that David Hume was talking about in, the dialogues on natural religion. So even though that's a new argument, the anthropic principle, it's basically an old argument. And there's no way to verify that or test it or submit it to any kind of experimentation. So that's why I think people like the positivists, and I think even going back to Hume, would have sort of bracketed it out and said, like, well, this is not knowledge. This is something else.
It seems like the alternative track that people are taking now are saying, well, the reason it makes sense is because we are meaning-making animals. And so we make meaning out of it. But to me, that seems like it's trying to get away from the metaphysical issue again. It's saying, well, that's all we are if we evolved, and if it's some sort of straight empirical system, natural, so to speak, system, that we just evolved and we have the minds that make meaning. This is one of the arguments that's in the last few years. Yeah. And that's all there is to it. And so if you think there's meaning in the world, it's just meaning in your head. Everything else is just also we create the meaning called metaphysics. That's
a good point. Like, I suppose this started with Kant, who instead of saying like, oh, the space and time are out there in the world or causation is out there, instead he was like, actually, those appear to be faculties of the mind, or we would sort of modernize Kant by saying these are models of the mind, and the mind brings these things to our experience. So Kant said, you can't help but see the world teleologically. Try as much as you can. You're going to see a story with a sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a directionality when you look at nature. And that might be, that's the subjective turn. Away from traditional objective metaphysics, like Aristotle thought the purpose is actually in the material thing. It's in the acorn becoming the tree or whatever. Whereas I think after Kant, the idea was, human beings must see the world in these trajectory, purposeful sort of patterns. But that doesn't mean they're really there. Now, can you get around your subjective faculties to see what really is there? And, Kant thought, no, you can't. And Hegel thought, in a way, you kind of can. But it's this radically different. He's got a very different kind of metaphysics. I don't know if you want to get into Hegel or not.
Well, I think it might be worth getting into phenomenology, and I don't know if we could talk about this object-based ontology, which is sort of coming up now too, but or the process metaphysics, the Whitehead. Yeah. Those are all these alternative ways of saying, well, we can get in touch with the reality, but reality is not what you think it is. It's a set of processes for Whitehead. It's a who's the other person I referred to? First person.
You were talking about object-oriented ontology. You said Whitehead. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's right. There's a sense in which, I don't know Whitehead that well, but there was a backlash against what I would call substance metaphysics that happened. It sort of happened in biology first, because biologists said, from Aristotle all the way down through Newton and all the way up to Darwin, the belief was, even though I'm changing and you're changing as individual biological animals, the Homo sapiens never changes, that the species is fixed. Darwin comes along and goes, actually, the species is an abstraction of a very slow changing population. So there is no essence man. There is no essence rational animal that lasts forever and ever. So the Greeks were wrong about fixed essences or substances like that. Instead, what you have is quickly changing individuals and slower changing populations, but species change too. Then something similar happened in physics, which is basically quantum mechanics comes along and explodes substance like physics, and what you get is, instead of little billiard ball atoms knocking into each other in some kind of Laplacian trajectory, you get clouds of probability that you can statistically predict within certain ranges, and that's the kind of end of substance-based metaphysics there. So biology and physics, and then I think what Whitehead and philosophers were doing was trying to catch up in a way. And Dewey was doing this too, like there must be a different metaphysics because nature's not what we thought it was when we were old school Democritus type atomists, and it's not like Aristotle said it was. It's radically different. So process metaphysics is, I think, an attempt to make sense out of a post-Darwinian nature.
Well, one thing that strikes me is when you start getting into biology, you start getting into physics and quantum physics, is that the scales of these objects and these processes are either very large, way larger than any single human life, and way smaller than any human can perceive.
Right.
And it makes me start to think that maybe, our lives are short, like less than 100 years each person. Maybe it's part of the mind is to try to freeze the world into some recognizable set of objects and properties and processes so that one can live with the limited mind that we have. Maybe it's a timescale size thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you think about the evolution of the mind, our kinds of minds, we're bounded by a certain sense of time. Like you said, our lifespan is only like 100 years. Now compare that with some of these animals that live for like a day.
Yeah.
Some of these animals, like their sexual maturity phase is one day, and so however, now I think you and I are together on this, but I think the level of mind that you have in an insect like a mayfly is going to be extremely rudimentary and probably very apropos to its rather modest needs as an organism, just to make more of itself. But then, there are these animals or creatures that have much longer lifespans than us. One thinks about some of these trees, for example, that are like 1,000 years old or whatever. Yeah. But what about minds that are much older than us? I know there's like sea creatures that live for hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
So if we think about concepts as a kind of the representations that the mind has as a reflection of the survival challenges that the organism has, then they might well have a different metaphysics than we have, because we see things in a way that makes middle-sized objects look like relatively stable substances. But if you had a very fast, time span, or a very long or slow time span, then objects themselves might, in fact, look and be very different to you. So that's a good point. Our metaphysics is a reflection of our perceptual and cognitive power based on an evolution within a certain kind of environment.
Yeah, and then you have to start thinking about the environment. So these turtles probably don't have the involved social hierarchies and civilization that we have, and the natural language, of course. It seems like those are the contexts or the beds within which our limited scales need to put things together. And if getting us back to the question of metaphysics, which is why are we pulled towards it? An alternative question too would be, what about societies that we know less about, or more shortened scale, or societies without printing presses and ways of memorializing knowledge? Strikes me that what's the metaphysics of those? There was that book, something. These are snakes. Remember that book about a culture that had a very different language?
Grammar structure. That's right. The guy went to the Amazon.
Remember that?
I think. Yeah, I'm blanking on it too.
But he was arguing something very radical, that they have different notions of time, different notions of something. That language, this Wittgensteinian thing, that language is structuring metaphysics.
Yeah, that's a good. Let's assume we're going to figure that out and put it down in the links. Who this guy? I think even some of our listeners will remember who he was. It was a book that was kind of a challenge to the Chomsky thesis that there's a deep grammar in all human languages, and this guy had found this tribe that was that didn't seem to have the same kind of substantival language. It was either more of a process language or something like this.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah. But the general idea, I think, is interesting. Like, in the same way that the perceived world of objects would influence things like our metaphysics, because Aristotle thinks there's substances and there's predicates, and Steve is a substance and being hungry is a predicate. So if you look at Aristotle's metaphysics, there's this whole discussion about what makes a substance, parousia. And so metaphysics is very interested in what's a substance and what's an attribute or a predicate of that substance. But you're right, language is also tilting us towards substances because language has this sort of noun preference. Like, I'm not a linguist, but I know some people think that the way you learn language is first by naming objects, and then slowly you build up sort of more active verb and adjectival or and adverbial kinds of relations. But yeah, it might be the case that naming objects and basically the tendency towards nouns in the language might also be a huge influence on the metaphysics. And it might be misdirecting us about what the nature of reality is like, just because that's how our linguistic system works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this practical thing of how do we live our lives, but then there's, like, we're getting at the experts. What are the experts doing? Like right now, I guess the question would be, what is is there a dominant form of metaphysics across the sciences, across the physical sciences?
Yeah, I'd say, like, the traditional metaphysical questions were like, is there a God? Is there a soul? What's the nature of causation? Is there freedom or determinism? And I would say that most of that stuff fell out of professional philosophy in the mid to late 20th century. It kind of came back a little bit with people like Davidson arguing...
the multiple worlds?
Yeah, multiple worlds, possible world stuff, although very arcane, but still a kind of return of metaphysics. And I would say, again, what's happening now is people are at least starting to do metaphysics again, in part because I think what Davidson was interested in and what philosophers of that ilk were interested in is what do we do with counterfactual type claims, things that we can say are meaningfully and seem to have truth value but aren't actual, don't conform or correspond to reality. But I would say now what's happening is people seem obsessed with the free will question, because as we look more in the brain, people are starting to say, well, maybe free will is just an illusion, and the machinery of the brain is just a mechanical system. So I think you and I have talked a little bit about free will and determinism before. I think you're more on the determinist side of things. Am I right?
I think so. I mean,
not to put you on the spot.
No, I mean,
not to out you as a determinist.
I'm. It's unclear. The question is it's an odd question.
Mm-hmm.
To say, is there such a thing as free will? Then I always just think, at what level is that question to be asked or to be answered? Is it at the immediate, am I going to say this or not? Am I going to move or not? Or at the larger scale, what are my goals and etc. And an even smaller scale, each movement, each tiny movement. The scale question makes it seem silly. And then that was the question, Benjamin Libet, or Libet, I don't know what they call him. I think it's, but he wanted to do this. He wanted to say, okay, when do you have the desire to move your hand, and when do you actually move it, and when does the brain do something? And there's all this literature about this, that basically, I think it's 50 or 500 milliseconds before your brain does something, before you move. And there's a discussion that maybe you just have not free will, but free won't.
Oh yeah,
you have a chance
free
to
won't.
veto.
Yeah,
chance to veto that decision. To me, that was sort of set up in a very bizarre way, and again,
the experiment was set up in a bizarre way.
The question is, unfortunately, I think that psychology and psychologists have neglected metaphysics. You really only hear about this stuff like, is it dualism or monism? Are you a limited materialist, or it's just not dealing with the issues. And I think when you get into free will, you got to get metaphysics into it to say, what's the scale of the question? Or else it's the same thing as asking, are you a dualist of a monist? You're just asking someone, are they religiously, did they grow up religious or not? Do they have some belief or not? Same thing with free will. You're just asking someone if they want to believe in free will or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like it is oftentimes phrased like you're either this or that, and in fact, that's a non-starter question unless you contextualize it. Like, are we talking about a felt sense of agency when I move through the day? Are we talking about moral responsibility when a criminal has committed a crime? Like, what exactly are we talking about in those cases? And I think that's a good point. The tendency, I think, of the metaphysician is to think of it in terms of there's a sort of a machinery of nature that is the brain, and it does not admit of another kind of entity, which is a kind of some miraculous spiritual infusion, into the sort of mechanism of the brain that sparks free will. And of course, a little bit of reflection reveals that that's a silly way to think about it, and a non-starter. But there is this kind of to talk about the sort of subjective turn from another side. There's the kind of philosophy that Robin George Collingwood, the British philosopher, was doing, and he said, forget about this, whether these entities are real or that they're substances. He says human beings have what he called relative presuppositions and absolute presuppositions. And what he meant, I think, was that when you're doing sort of biology nowadays, microbiology, what's at the back of your research program? There's something like, the understanding of natural selection, some sense of evolution. That might be a kind of relative presupposition. You're not calling it into question, you're just doing your work, your experiment. But then he says there are these absolute presuppositions that are really deep, or really at the back, and hard to even discover and bring to the fore. And here he's thinking about stuff like, is nature rational? Like really deep stuff. Like, why would you pursue science if you thought nature had no rational structure to be discovered? So it's an absolute presupposition that nature has some rational structure to it. And so, too, I think there's a kind of absolute presupposition on the part of most people that they have some kind of free will or free agency. Is it a thing? No. Is it even something you can verify or do science with? No. But it's the way thought works is it has to be there sort of in the background in order for some of these other inferences to work properly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think it's very important to pair that with what we were saying earlier, which is well, is it natural or supernatural? And bring up the question of how do contemporary physical sciences prescribe what is natural and what is not natural?
Yeah.
And you see this in the proliferation of, ghost stories and ways of trying to quantify it. They do these things where they try to have these infrared things and they read, they always bring in an implement to sort of, and is it legitimizing or is it naturalizing? Like, oh, okay, now we're naturalizing the supernatural. So now the supernatural, so to be real, you have to be measurable. There's that assumption. And I think that the people have a lot of this frisson from the supernatural.
Yeah,
everyone wants to believe in the ghost. We've seen that with our students. Everyone believes in the ghost.
Right.
But there's something about it. It seems like it's not about ghosts. It's about, do you think that nature is not a closed system, or that you can talk about things that are not plain materials? Right.
Yeah. I think that's right. Like, I was asking my students the other day, why are they, because the millennials and the Gen Z folks are considered the least religious demographic. They always check the none box, NONE, on terms of religious affiliations. And I was asking them to sort of speculate about why that is, and of course they have one of the explanations that they had for this was, well, we're much more scientifically literate than you guys were, previous generations, and they see this sort of triumph of science education they think has made them hostile to or less interested in the metaphysics of religion. Now, that seems like a good explanation until you start pressing them further, like you were saying, and it turns out they're deeply metaphysical. They're totally they're not into religion because it's an organized institution and has these problems, but they're into the spirit realm and the soul and the ghosts and they're pretty into that stuff.
Yeah, we have tarot
you have to be
cards,
careful because your thing is sort of scraping on your.
Oh, sorry.
If you lean forward, I think it doesn't make as much noise, but.
Okay.
Yeah, tarot cards, witchcraft, a lot of this stuff. Alternative spirituality.
Alternative spirituality. And while, I did live in California and I hated it. I hated all that stuff about it. I have sympathies with people wanting to have larger causal structures or unanswered questions. I think that's kind of what people want too. They want some room to live and die, in a way that's has meaning or has some satisfaction, room for satisfaction.
And the traditional religions would have given them that, but if you reject that, you still want that room to sort of find meaning and to feel like you're in this larger cosmic adventure. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And so I guess, art and literature and the kind of stuff, like look at Star Wars or Harry Potter, like that's like religion without the old, without the old metaphysics, basically.
Yeah, I think it would be really fun to talk a little bit about fiction and narrative universes.
Yeah.
I just read Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. A brilliant book for many reasons, but one of them is his exploration of how does fiction create worlds, and why. And fiction is strange. Reality is strange. They're both strange. They're both making things up. Sometimes it doesn't matter if it's real or not real, if you act upon it.
Wow.
I'm also reading some of these historical documents about the French Revolution, and people would act on what they knew because there was no way to communicate across long distances. So it was real, although it was fake or a fiction. It's still real, and in some, I guess that's one topic to discuss before we get into the narrative universes. But
yeah, that is. There's all kinds of things that somebody could get riled up about here, because the idea that the fact that it's not real, makes every, sort of the hard-nosed realist want to run away or suggest that there's a lot of danger there because people can go off in flights of fancy. But I'm inclined to agree with you that the imagination is not just a sort of fantasizer, but actually a repository of action, of doing things, moving in the world, making decisions. And like you said, sometimes, in fact, I would say most of the time, you do not have all the information you need to act, but you have to act, whether it's in a military campaign, whether it's at your job, in your family life. I can't even exaggerate how many times raising a kid that I just felt like, oh my God, I wish there was some book that, of course there are books about parenting, but they suck. They're terrible. They're just useless. But I remember thinking like, I don't know what to do here, but I have to do something. And there's a sense in which, the imaginative life is not just sort of, mashing together interesting images or creating art. It's also helping us navigate through the practical world of action, helping us move through the world. Yeah,
I can think of so many situations in the last few years where I refer to, what did the character in Dostoevsky,
what would he do?
What did he do in that case? Or, I remember in that poem, this poet dealt with that, and that was that was the wisdom he put out there. And those things to me are answers. Like that was an answer to the question of how did you deal with this moral quandary, or how do you appreciate beauty in this context? Those were answers, and they're fiction in a way. It's not, but they're as real in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there is sort of a growing body of literature, I think, coming out of psychology too, about the sort of the power of not just placebo but fictional thinking. So this psychologist Tanya Luhrmann has done a lot of stuff on religion, and she's done some podcasts here on Meaning of Life TV. And her work is very interesting because she looks at people who are evangelical Christians, for example, and tries to say, well, how are you thinking about God or Jesus in your life? And it turns out to be sort of like what we're talking about here, which is in the same way that you're relating to literature and art to get answers and direction and meaning, they're thinking about Jesus as if, he's here in the room and they're having a conversation with him. And it's an imaginary conversation, but if you do it enough, you begin to, those kinds of conversations start to become privileged among the internal dialogue of your own thinking, such that you feel that they carry more weight and gravitas, and then it feels even more real to you. And I mean, we could wave our hands against all this stuff and just say, come on, this is just all magical thinking. We should be just cured of it as soon as possible. But I think there's something much more universal happening here, which is what we're using these narrative structures for in terms of guiding meaning, and what traditional metaphysics has been for, and even what these evangelical Christians are doing, is all part of the sort of motion of the mind that hasn't been properly appreciated by cognitive science or even evolutionary psychology, and in that sense, the mind is richer than we've been thinking.
Yeah, and to bring emotions back into this thing, it strikes me that metaphysics is our way of dealing with the emotions of awe and the sublime. We call it art too, but in a way, art elevates us.
Yeah,
and metaphysics is the elevation. It's like it's somewhere else, or the real. It's almost still the Platonic thing. Like there is something realer than this.
Yeah.
And we are sometimes lifted up to it by a great concert, by a great, anything. We see a great painting. Something does it.
Yeah.
And it could be the discussion with JC, or it could
JC.
be, but it could be
not JZ, but JC.
JC. It could be that, or it could be. I mean, for many of us, and we talked about this last time. It's in the musical context, and we have sublime feelings, or awe, wonder, awe, and we tend to think of them in metaphysical terms.
Yeah, in the this book that you and I have just finished, and it's coming out with Harvard in a couple of months here. I think May, right, or April. It's coming out in April. Yeah. We spend some time at the very end of the book talking about the religious emotions, and I think this idea of the sublime is interesting. Like, is it part of the original cognitive architecture that evolved, sort of, in the pre-sapiens phase of our evolution? And are we inclined towards metaphysics because we have this psychological feeling of transcendence, or like sometimes some scholars have called it the unitive experience, or the oceanic experience, like that I'm connected to everything, or something like this. And if that's a natural feature of the human mind, then I think maybe metaphysics is an attempt to formalize that feeling into a kind of more systematic theory.
Well, the other striking thing about it is that our systematizations of it are legion.
Yeah, right.
So you have this guru says it like this. This religion does it. I mean, but it's similar things that we're all going through that we contextualize and we put them into our own metaphysical scopes.
Yeah, and I guess that's what gives rise to the sort of interfaith movement, which says, well, the fact that all these, whether you're Muslim or you're Jewish or Christian or Hindu, the fact that people describe the God or the unconditioned in similar ways, the explosion of the little self and the ego, that leads the interfaith people to go, aha, you see, it's all the same God, and we just got different faces of the same God. But, right. I think the psychologist, or even the evolutionary psychologist, is going to be like, well, it's the core experience is in the human mind. And then all of these mythologies are ways to try to make sense out of that core experience. Mm-hmm. I mean, we talked about this before, but look in the Bhagavad Gita, you've got the revelation of God, of Vishnu, through the chariot driver, and it blows the mind. Now, what's an interesting question is like, well, is this transcendent experience of awe or the sublime, is it adaptive in some way, or is it just the byproduct of having other kind of adaptive mental architecture?
I think it's the total emotional saturation. There's something like that going on.
Could that be good for you, or
it feels good, doesn't it?
That's true. It does feel good.
It feels like you're finally living in reality, and too, in a way, it's the non-banal. It's the elevated plane. I mean, it's like inspiration when you really are somewhere, as a musician, or when the words are coming out and they're coming out right. There is this elevation.
Yeah.
But we don't know. I mean, there's also been this discussion of it as flow, flow state. We talked about this before too, about maybe that's what it is. So maybe flow is the type of, it's just that fluency, cognitive fluency. Maybe that's the secular version of talking about the elevated state.
Yeah.
And, James has a whole book where he's just chapter after chapter saying, here's what we call mystical. Here's a religious experience, and here's this version. Here's Saint Teresa doing it. Here's a Muslim scholar. Remember, he's doing that throughout the book. And it's funny too, the interfaith thing, like as if, now we're going to unite, but precisely because we have so many different ways of contextualizing it, we cannot be united.
Cannot unite.
Those cultural forms are real.
Yeah, that's right.
They might be even more real than these temporary states of elevation.
Yeah, I think the assumption of the secular humanist is that if we strip away those cultural forms, we'll all arrive at some common transcendental or sublime experience and bond over that as a kind of substitute for traditional, tribal forms of religion. But I think you're right; those cultural forms are real, and you can't really abstract, except in like we're doing now, sitting around talking about it, is when we can abstract the experience from the cultural milieu or the activity. But in reality, it's tied to those things. Now, one could argue that it would be better to drop the metaphysics and just celebrate the psychology of it all. You know what I mean? Like, what are people killing each other over? It's the metaphysics, not the experience. So if you could train people off the assumption that they're communing with God and God wants them to do X, Y, and Z, it would be better because then everybody could just enjoy. We'd all just become lotus eaters, and just enjoy the wonderful transcendental experiences. I don't think that's on the horizon because these cultural forms, like you said, are real. But the fact that we can entertain this possibility suggests that there is a stepping away or a separation.
And I think this is a good time to bring in this idea of the narrative universe, because these communities, like these Star Wars people and Harry Potter people,
all the cosplay people,
right, they'll put on costumes. I think it's like, okay, we have a shared metaphysical world, narrative world that we all know all the stuff about, and maybe it is a kind of secular metaphysical structure, and it has room to move around. It's imaginative.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been so much talk about what is Star Wars really? What are the Tao, right?
Mm-hmm.
They talk about the Tao. And
the Force is like the Tao. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know much about the other one, but I know there's a lot of magic and hierarchy and evil, good and evil, and stuff like that. So to me, maybe something like that's going on. That it's our new way of creating these metaphysics things without also having. You don't have to believe in Harry Potter. You just have to read him.
Yeah.
You don't have to believe in Darth Vader, but you see the movies.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. It has all the cultural accoutrement that a religion has, without some of the metaphysical assumptions. Although when I ask some people about it, they're pretty hardcore, and the stuff about the Force, they can't even go there. I don't know if they're being ironic about it or if they're being literal. But here's a sort of counter argument, which is all that makes sense if you're living a relatively cushy, prosperous life. You know what I mean? Like, if your life is not, like, you're not in a war-torn region where you're just trying to survive and fight off enemies, then things like, Star Wars or Harry Potter can be very satisfying and fulfill a number of these kinds of needs that we have. But when life is much harder, like, it can be in the developing world. I just got back from, 2 weeks in Burma. I lived in Cambodia. There, I feel like the metaphysics comes to the rescue more. Like, you almost need the metaphysics, because what you're talking about is not like dressing up like a stormtrooper and going down with your friends and having a good time. You're talking about your kid is dying, like serious shit. And there, it's like the literary narratives and artistic narratives don't seem to have what it takes, whereas the notion that the God or the Buddha is going to fix this or help you is much more needed or requisite.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but I think that people who who are Harry Potter heads, they die too, and their kids die too, and they have that. But do they turn to those systems? Are those systems? Do they have consolation in them? I mean, we also have to add in that these narrative systems are embedded in consumer brands and consumer universes. So as soon as you have the Star Wars, you have the Star Wars figures. As soon as you have the Harry Potter, you have I don't know what the hell they do.
Yeah, the merchandising.
The merchandise. So there is also something like that going on, like as a consolation. If you are sick, do you buy the person? Oh, this person loves that. I love Harry Potter. Buy me that crap. That's that's all built into
Right.
the consolation system within a consumer society.
Yeah.
You take metaphysics, put it in this kind of system, and it has a consolatory.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, and maybe it has an equivalent consolatory
I don't know.
effect. Here's an example related to what you're saying, which is I was talking to a woman who worked in hospice, which is somebody comes to the hospital and basically they're dying, and what hospice is doing is making their passing more comfortable. Oftentimes, this means slowly ramping up the levels of morphine that the person is getting until eventually, I think what happens is once you get the dosage up high enough, the patient stops breathing, essentially.
Right.
But you're doing this very slowly, and you're making the person as comfortable as possible. And what she was telling me was that when she had really religious families, like the person in hospice was of a religious family, the family was always coming and bringing religious objects and doing devotional stuff and talking about religion a lot with her as a nurse and also with their loved one who was dying. But when it was she also worked like on the North Shore of Chicago here, which is a fairly wealthy and well-educated demographic. And she said there, the family would come in, and unlike the sort of religious groups who didn't really ask her much about the science of what was happening, the North Shore folks would come in and they would want to know very detailed what's happening to the brain, what's happening to the heart, what's happening to the body. It was almost like the facts of anatomy and medicine and science had their own strangely consoling aspect. It was like if they could understand that stuff, they could process the death better. So I offer it just as another way of thinking about maybe you don't need religious metaphysics, but you need something to make sense out of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be secular, like in the form of art, like put it into your Star Wars context, or it can be secular in the form of put it in your scientific context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder about the consolations of science. I think one of the consolations of science is drugs.
Yeah.
That all these things have turned into drugs that can manipulate the mind into whatever mood you want to get rid of or get into. In a way, that's the body of Christ, of science.
It's the real painkiller.
Yeah.
Skip the story and just go right to the chemicals.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be talk therapy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
People say it takes too long, it costs too much. So they just
that's right.
go with the drug.
Well, I think we're basically nearing the end of our time here, and I think it's been kind of a rich conversation. Was there anything else you felt like we didn't touch on that you wanted to get to in this conversation about metaphysics?
I wonder if we could, if it's worth thinking about the future of metaphysics.
Yeah.
Thinking, well, let's say that science keeps a pace. Well, there's two ways to look at it. You could say, well, science keeps a pace, and more and more supernatural things get tucked away. I wonder if you could even fetishize the natural processes. Like there was a whole fetishization, a reification of energy.
Oh, yeah.
Remember all that discussion? And then quantum mechanics, people want to look at the most abstract thing to think that there's something hidden there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one path we could talk about. The other path is what if there is a cataclysmic sort of event, and then much of our civilization, our recorded civilization, is in jeopardy. Then what kinds of things start to happen? I just finished reading a book on the French Revolution, and so when things get really hairy and confused, people's behavior is savage.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Cutting heads off, carrying them around on pikes, killing and playing with blood. Really like barbaric things. But they had symbology. There was a symbology to the carcasses of the dead and all these things. The king's head. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple of avenues. I don't know which one you want to pursue.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, metaphysics will follow rather than, I think, lead. I think that's probably inevitable and probably how it should be. We've seen what happens when it leads. It's not pretty. But I think you're right. The future holds some interesting stuff for metaphysics. I think things like AI, artificial intelligence, is bringing metaphysics back a little bit, because there's the epistemic question of when would you recognize whether a supercomputer had attained consciousness. But there's the metaphysical question of personhood. Is it the case that when you get enough computing together, you actually can have consciousness arise? That's basically a metaphysical question. The Turing test is an epistemological question. When would you recognize when a computer had become conscious? But the metaphysical question has to be behind that, which is it the case that we're playing with technologies now that may create persons with protectable moral rights in non-biological substrates? So I think for some people that's a way of getting back to metaphysics, although it's relatively sci-fi, I think, to my mind, but it's still an interesting question. So I think the future holds, if not a return to metaphysics, it's certainly not done. It's certainly not over. There have been some scientists recently, Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson and a couple of other sort of big name scientists were sort of dismissing philosophy. This happened about 3 or 4 years ago. You remember this? Sort of like, well, philosophy, it's over with, metaphysics. I just think this is very naive and sort of an uneducated thing to say, because if anything, science itself has grown more metaphysical in its character than it had in the past, and that's fine. But I think metaphysics is always going to be sort of lurking in the background, and I think productively so, if it's done properly.
Yeah, just kind of end saying similar thing, that metaphysics has consolation or consolatory functions in response to elevated emotional states, and of course, elevated emotional state of finding meaning in one's life.
Yeah.
And usually you're going to need a system. I mean, you could definitely try to do it with the constellations of this, computer drunk world we have with these easy interfaces and these consumer products. But I think that it might satisfy a lot of people, but for some other people, there's little gaps that require thinking, stretching thought to its limits.
Yeah, I also think it's in the background of good science too. Metaphysics, it helps guide research programs. If you think about the organism, in a different way, that it's not just sort of a cog in a machine, but maybe it's in a dialectical relationship with the environment, it might actually help you in terms of your empirical work as well. So there's a way to think about metaphysics as provisional for doing good work until it stops being good work, and then you can re-examine both the empirical work and the metaphysics. So it's all up for renegotiation, I think. That's one of the great insights of the pragmatists, which is you don't just arrive at a metaphysics and you're done. You're always revising the metaphysics too. So I think on that note, we should wrap up, and I'll say thank you, Rami, as usual.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.
And we'll see everyone next time. Cheers.